Welcome back to It's Personal. It's Personal is brought to you by Gundersen Health System. I'm Christopher. Today we're talking about what I would call a very difficult topic to talk about. It's child sex abuse. Unfortunately, it is a common thing that we have to talk about. It happens all too often. We see it in the media. It's a local, a regional, a statewide, a Midwest, a national problem, and international problem. Joining us to talk about this is our two experts. Stephanie Young. Stephanie is the Clinical Manager of Crime Victim Services at Gundersen Health System. And also I'd like to welcome Rhonda Bryhn, and she is a psychotherapist, a sexual abuse counseling program, also at Gundersen Health System. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
It's a difficult topic. As I said, this isn't a local problem, a regional problem, statewide, national, it is an international problem. But how big of a problem, what do the stats say?
Well, I'm glad we're talking about it, because the more we talk about it, the more likely we are to be able to intervene.
I agree.
Stats are difficult because experts tell us that children often do not report when they're being abused, adults either. But statistics show that approximately 1 in 5 to 7 girls are sexually abused before they're 18, and about 1 in 20 to 25 boys before age 18.
Those are pretty amazing statistics, even knowing that many are going underreported or not reported at all. And we heard about the Me Too movement, and we heard more about how many women were coming forward about some of that, sex abuse. So I guess the question is, are we going to see more of this? How do we get ahead of this?
Yeah, I think the response from the Me Too movement, what we saw from that was the more communication that we have around these topics, the more understanding people have of what it means, what that experience looks like. And so with our services, we do see a lot of people who are in adulthood now who experienced sexual abuse in childhood and who didn't realize until they got to adulthood that what they experienced was not appropriate. And I think that's one advantage to the Me Too movement. As we open more conversation about it, people feel more empowered and aware that what they experienced was not okay and that they can ask for help.
Recently, Stephanie and I were in a media interview, and Stephanie was talking about how the summer is starting and how coaches and nannies and many new adults are introduced to our children. What's the message to both the coach or the nanny or the new adult, and what's the message to parents?
It's a really good question.
It's a great question. It's a big question. I think to parents, I'll start with parents. The question is educating children about body safety. So that would be a good place to begin, encouraging parents to talk to children very young about body safety, about private parts being parts that only people who need to care for a child can touch, that it's not okay for other people to touch a child's private parts or to ask the child to touch somebody else's, to talk about what private parts are called, their proper names, and what to do if someone were to try to touch a child inappropriately, because we know the more comfortable children are talking about those things, the more likely they'll be to report it and to be able to talk about it clearly. Probably the most important things that parents can convey to kids is that if someone is making them uncomfortable in any way, or violating those body safety rules, that it's okay to tell, and that no matter what, the child will not get in trouble for having told.
You mentioned starting that conversation early at a very young age. That's kind of a broad term. How do you know what age you should talk to your child or talk to children about this? Or is it different for every child?
Well, I think it depends a little bit on a child's vocabulary and understanding, but I would start as soon as a child is able to have a sense of of his or her body and general rules of behavior. So very young, even preschool, and to talk in a way that's appropriate, of course, to your child's age and development, not offering too much information, but starting to convey early on that their body belongs to them, they're in charge of it, and that if they're feeling not okay or icky or a child appropriate word to tell someone.
Yeah, good point. Again, we're talking with Rhonda Bryhn, psychotherapist, sexual abuse counseling program, and Stephanie Young, clinical manager of the Crime Victim Services Unit at Gundersen Health System. I hope you don't mind me sharing this, Stephanie, but you talked about your husband is doing some coaching and how, because he knows you and how some behaviors are appropriate and some are not appropriate, that sometimes he's even finding himself having to communicate to others to say, hey, it's not okay to maybe do some of these things. What kind of things should coaches and nannies or fellow coaches know or communicate as they go into the summer months with kids around and oftentimes in a situation where they're supervising?
Yeah, I think that awareness is important because too often we focus a little bit too much on the children and the parents having the responsibility of preventing child sexual abuse from happening. And we don't talk about, we don't focus enough on the people who do the abusing or just on general public people who are good people who aren't ever going to abuse. And I think those conversations that my husband as a coach has been subject to is well-meaning adults who would not abuse a child being in situations in which abuse does flourish. And sort of them taking a responsibility to say, I have a role in keeping this child safe and showing them what's appropriate for them to do one-on-one with an adult or not. And so an example of that being a lot of coaching programs, schools, things like that will try to prevent situations in which an adult and a child are one-on-one, especially behind a closed door. And that's an important way to prevent those things from happening, or even just communicate to children, right? That's not a space that they should frequent often with another adult that's not a parent. And again, sort of, if it's especially a nanny situation, I could see being aware of what's the type of communication that the parent has modeled for the child and empowering that child to use that with them as well. My body, my choice, those types of things. The adults being aware of that and empowering the child to utilize their voice is important, because the reason that children are especially at risk for sexual abuse is because they don't have power or agency. So empowering them to use those things is great.
We're going to talk about social media, the social media aspect of child sex abuse, but we're going to take a quick time out. We're talking about, again, the very difficult topic of child sex abuse, sexual assault. That's on It's Personal. It's Personal is brought to you by Gundersen Health System. Welcome back to It's Personal. It's Personal is brought to you by Gundersen Health System. Joining us today is Stephanie Young, clinical manager, crime victim services at Gundersen Health System, and Rhonda Bryhn, psychotherapist in the sexual abuse counseling program at Gundersen Health System. Again, thanks for being here. I want to talk and touch on the topic of social media and child sex abuse, because more than ever, the communication tools are there for good and evil, if you will. And how are, shall we say, perpetrators using social media? What do parents, again, need to be mindful of?
I think, like you said, there are benefits and there are definitely dangers of social media. And I think a lot of perpetrators use it as one of their tools to groom a child, often to make a child trust and go along with things that lead the way to an abusive situation. So perpetrators can befriend children that way and develop a relationship that may be really inappropriate to that adult's role in the child's life. Parents are able to do a lot of things to try to ensure safety with social media use, like becoming familiar with sites and vehicles that children use,
Sure.
to understand how
Different
they work.
different apps.
Exactly. Understand safety mechanisms, privacy. It's often recommended that the computer, your children will protest, but be put in a really open setting in the home so that parents can be aware of what a child's doing on the site. But I think most important is helping children understand how perpetrators use social media. Children tend to underestimate the fact that their activity will be viewed by others. They tend to overestimate how private it is and not understand the impact of certain things that are posted for their future. Or understand the intentions of others. So being really honest with them about those things will go a long way.
And I got to assume that parents talking to other parents is also helpful. What are you seeing? What are you learning from different leaders of their children or people that are in a leadership role around their children?
Right. And that's an excellent point because parents, as you're implying, cannot be everywhere all the time, especially with older kids too and activities. It's not the case that a parent necessarily attends every event, so we can rely on other parents to observe what's happening, share concerns, communicate. Sometimes it can be helpful too to share with a coach that other parents will be there if you're not, so they know adults are watching. Sometimes parents are afraid of being the bad guy, so to speak, and setting limits, whether it's about social media use or about contact between their children and other adults. But it's okay to act out of a place of concern, act out of better be safe than sorry, and be clear about limits.
How do you monitor your children on social media? Is it possible? I mean, because let's face it, especially when it comes to teenagers, they're leading the way. I mean, they know much more about it than many people who are in information technology these days.
Yeah. I think that's where those conversations about what's appropriate, what rights you have as a child or as a teenager are really important because parents can't be everywhere at all times, and because they really can't be aware of, there are apps specifically designated for communication to disappear after certain periods of time. So there's just not a way for that to occur. So the more that they can empower that child to understand what relationships are appropriate, or even what level of communication is appropriate, some parents do that by saying, phones off, phones not in your rooms at a certain time of evening, where others just might have some general guidelines for these are the types of people you should be texting with versus only talking to in person. And I think that's one thing that adults, as you talked about, parents, they're afraid of being the bad guy. But if you start a new relationship with another adult who's going to be in your child's life, let's say it's going to be a coach, by saying, what types of communication can I expect that you're going to have with my child? They don't get down the line and then say, oh, they're texting and it seems like it's kind of late. What's going on here? So by establishing what's appropriate on the front end, parents have expectations. And that also sort of prepares, like you said, other parents to keep a lookout for that seems outside of the bounds of what we said this relationship was going to look like.
Is that one-on-one conversation a typical warning sign? Because let's face it, coaches are using this for good too. They're letting their player know that we're counting on you for the big game, or making sure that they're going to be there for soccer practice or whatever it may be. So is that one-on-one possibly a warning sign, or should it be group texts? Should it be
phones and computers? Just is another communication avenue,
right.
And as Rhonda mentioned, grooming is how perpetrators of this abuse prepare children to abuse them by building that trust, by building that relationship, and so phones are absolutely used in that way.
It seems like there's so much gray area. Am I wrong? And that's the challenge for both child, parent, and I'll say, you're supervisor of these children in whatever capacity that may be.
I'm going to suggest there isn't as much gray area as in that that I think we can encourage parents and other caregivers to listen to their guts. And if they are unsure about something, confused, have concerns, look into it. That doesn't mean we accuse somebody of something, but it's always a good idea to ask questions of the coach or whomever, but also your children. And you can ask children without being intrusive. And I think what's, like Stephanie alluded to earlier, what's important here is the concept of what fits the proper role of a coach. And things like inviting a child to go fishing, special rewards, talking about the adult's life with a child or trying to be the child's counselor, all those things don't really fit appropriately in the role of a coach. So if we keep the concept of what fits in this role versus somebody else's role, I think it's easier to notice when something's starting to veer outside of that boundary.
Yeah. Well, one of the gray areas that kind of comes up from time to time is coach giving a child a ride home after practice. Sometimes the parents need it. Sometimes the child, the parents are late, and yet, what is the proper thing for a coach or, someone in a one-on-one situation? Maybe in what I'm getting at is the gray area.
Yeah, I think that's where policies that prevent that type of one-on-one time are going to help both that coach from feeling uncomfortable saying no to the parent, from feeling they're not helping that student out in a situation, to say, like, the policy is that I can't be alone, especially within a personal vehicle. I think that's really another way that, as we talked about, those well-meaning adults who aren't going to abuse can help prevent abuse, is by advocating for those things. Because what we hear really often from those well-meaning adults is like, well, I wouldn't do anything, or that shouldn't be interpreted that way. But perception matters more than intent.
Yeah.
So
excellent point. And I don't ever want to make it sound like we're throwing all coaches under the bus, but we do certainly want to, as you said, have some policies and some parameters in place, some good rules for all of those individuals that we just talked about. We're going to take a time out, but when we come back, I want to talk a little bit about ACEs, and I want to talk a little bit about prevention. That's all next on It's Personal. It's Personal is brought to you by Gundersen Health System. Welcome back to It's Personal. It's Personal is brought to you by Gundersen Health System. Joining us again is Stephanie Young, Clinical Manager, Crime Victim Services, and Rhonda Bryhn, Psychotherapist for Sexual Abuse Counseling Program at Gundersen Health System, talking about child sex assault, abuse. A challenging topic, and certainly I want to give you both credit for all of the time that you both put into helping kids in our community. It's an unfortunate service that we need to have, but it is certainly a service that we all appreciate. So thank you for your expertise here today too on this challenging topic. We talked a little bit about warning signs, but I want to talk about prevention and warning signs. And I'm just going to lob it out there. What should we be looking for in the neighbor kid, in the neighbor family? What
$1 million question.
Yeah, right.
That's a great question, because the sooner we spot things that we have questions about, the faster we can look into it and intervene. It's tricky with child sexual abuse because there is no one set of symptoms that every child will have, or signs. And oftentimes, if a child's been sexually abused, there aren't necessarily injuries that accompany it. Nonetheless, there are things that are red flags that should give us concern as caretakers or observers, so that we talk to children. Some of those that are sexual in nature are children having sexually transmitted infections. Sometimes they're genital injuries, although most of the time not. Those would look like bruising, bleeding. But oftentimes we see with children changes in their emotions and their behaviors that aren't necessarily unique to sexual abuse. Doesn't necessarily mean that sexual abuse has taken place, but are signs of stress. Like with younger children, a child reverting to behaviors like bedwetting or thumb sucking or ways of speaking that they had when they were younger, nightmares, not wanting to be alone with a certain person or being really clingy with a caretaker, being fearful, anxious. With older kids, those things can be the case too, but you might see self-harming behaviors, some suicidal comments, isolating socially, not eating, having difficulties with sleep, acting out behaviors.
The challenge, it sounds like, is really knowing your child.
Exactly. Yeah. In other words, parents don't need to worry so much about checking boxes and having a checklist of what to notice, because it is different with every child. Know your child. Talk to your child about how their life is going. Talk to them about their friends, about adults, how they're feeling, and in that communication, if you notice things are changing, even if it's different grades, ask about it.
Up or down, is that possible, where they're suddenly super focused on school, or versus getting bad grades, which is I think what we'd normally associate, that they're not able to focus.
Right.
Some children actually will maybe overexcel in the classroom as a way to try to sort of create a safe space for them and where things are going right.
It seems counterintuitive to what we would naturally think about someone going through that situation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important for parents, with coupled with communication, again, to just trust their gut, because what we know about child sexual abuse is that it's not the stranger danger. That's not what makes up the bulk of child sexual abuse. It is people who your children know and who they are what we call trusted adults. And so parents being involved and aware and communicating about what those relationships look like to their children is really important, because in situations and as well as being known to the child, a lot of times you'll see that those perpetrators are also in positions where they're going to have regular access to children. So that's why we have been talking about coaches, although we're really thankful for the service they provide, and nannies and things like that, is that those people, when we don't follow our gut, they are able to then continue to perpetrate on that same child, and usually on many, many other children.
Or a teacher that's spending too much time or too much focus on an individual.
I think that follow your gut is hugely important, because I've met so many kids who've tried to convey to parents that they're distressed or suffering, and they may not know the language for communicating this. They don't have the concepts. So if parents hear anything, even if it's like, he touched me weird, that gives them pause, follow up on that. And parents, don't be afraid to be really direct and explicit about it too. I've had situations where parents have been afraid to straight up ask, and so ask around the topic, and kids don't always understand that. So straight up ask your kids. Just like you ask about, are you taking your vitamins, or do you have your math book? Check in with them from time to time and ask them if these situations are happening.
Put your own phone down and have a conversation, right? Which is a challenge for a lot of us.
Because kids actually want you to ask.
Yeah. We're just about out of time, but I do want to ask about ACEs and how getting, having those conversations early and having I'll say an intervention for lack of a better word, sooner rather than later, why that is such a key part of this.
Sexual abuse is absolutely an average childhood experience that can have significant impacts on an adult later in life, health, whether that's physical health or mental health. So we see the connection between sexual abuse in childhood and a lot of negative health outcomes.
The earlier we can intervene to address those areas of impact, the less likely it will be that those adverse outcomes will happen or that the degree of impact will be less. Also, if we can work with children as young as possible, sometimes the less likely it is that they'll have some social and other interpersonal difficulties, other traumas. So we're also preventing future trauma.
And again, we're out of time, but I do want to ask, where do people turn should they have a suspicion if they feel like their child, the neighbor child, or someone in their family has an issue, their gut is telling them something? Where do they go?
That's a good question.
I would say if someone has...
And and I realize that's a kind of a generic thing, because it is, and I think that's why it's such a good question, is because it's so different for all, and I think many individuals are reluctant to ask that question or have that conversation. Am I wrong?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I think that's why we appreciate talking about it so much, is because I think people don't always know what will happen if they try to talk about it. This makes it easier, having information. After a parent has had a concern and spoken with their child, if they're still concerned, I would suggest calling the county human services to speak to an intake worker about any concern. And the wonderful thing about that is a person doesn't have to call with, quote, proof that something has occurred, just a concern. And then people who are trained in addressing this problem will take it from there.
Yeah. Would a pediatrician be another option?
Pediatrician would be another wonderful person.
You could go, it kind of depends on the system, maybe that's most comfortable for that adult. And I think a lot of systems, the professionals you would talk to are mandated child reporters. So a pediatrician, a teacher, a guidance counselor, they're all going to be mandated child abuse reporters. But they're then going to go to that county professional with that information. So I think it depends on the comfort level for that adult.
All right. Good
it's
information.
Just important to remember, you don't have to figure out indeed whether a crime occurred, just have a concern. And it's so much better to have someone look into it than to have the child carry around a secret.
All right. Good, excellent point. Rhonda, Bryhn, Stephanie Young, thank you so very much for your time. And if you want to learn more about this topic, you can certainly go to the Gundersen Health System website. That's gundersenhealth.org. That's going to do it for this edition of It's Personal. It's Personal is brought to you by Gundersen Health System. I'm Chris Stauffer. Thanks for joining us.